So I thought that I would discuss a few things that have been on my mind today, just a few things that I've been pondering upon and reflecting upon. So I want to talk about how when one is a mother and carer simultaneously, often what happens is the role of carer is omitted, and the perception, I don't really want to say identity, but yeah, the perception of mother and that image of mother and what that entails overrides everything else. So therefore, anything to do with being in a caring role to a disabled child or a child that is neurodivergent then gets omitted because of being a mother. And then in that same regard, because of being a mother, the needs of that individual that is also a mother are also omitted, and the individualization and the personalization of that person who's also a mother is also omitted. This manifests itself in a lot of different ways. Some things that spring to my mind is, for example, assessments. As carers, as mother carers, oftentimes we have to undergo multiple assessments for our child. But what happens in the process of these assessments is that it's not just the child that's being assessed. You as a mother is also heavily being assessed. So ultimately, the lens of which professionals view your child is through you as a mother, and how good you are as a mother, how close you fit to the perfect mother myth, and that of institutionalized motherhood, which is, are you doing all of the typical things? Are you doing a reward chart? Are you enforcing appropriate boundaries? Are you just at that happy midpoint of being stern enough to enforce those boundaries, but not too stern where you're, causing your child stress or inflicting any way of harm, right? And it's actually a very, very, very small binary, a very rigid binary that mothers of disabled and neurodivergent children just simply don't fit into, because our children don't manifest their behaviours the way that a non-disabled or neurotypical child would. So things such as boundaries, as an example, what is a boundary to a neurotypical person is different to a neurodivergent person who might not have the same cognitive understanding, might not have the same executive function, etc., etc., etc. They quite simply might not be capable of those boundaries, so you have to move the boundaries and adjust them in accordance with need and in accordance of what that child can or can't do. And I guess the crux of the issue is that historically, in feminist movements, mothers have not been represented. Mothers as a separate group from being a woman, because it's a different type of institutionalized maltreatment in accordance with being a mother. It's on the primary basis that you're a mother, right? And in that regard, mothers have not been able to individualize, conceptualize, or identify themselves as their own autonomous group. And so what often happens when you go for these assessments, when you try to get the help for your child, is that You are not seen as a separate entity from your child. You are not seen as an individual carer for a child with additional needs or disabilities. You are simply seen as the mother, and the mother is always looked at through the lens of what is she doing for the child? What is she doing in regards to being a useful tool as a means to an end? I'm not saying that children shouldn't be cared for, shouldn't have their needs met. Of course they should. Of course we need to assess this. 100% we need to assess parenting capacity. But we also need to accept that mothers are individuals in their own right, and that mother carers are also taking on a caring role parallel to that of their mothering role. It's not either or. And we need to address this with nuance rather than looking at it through a lens of the other. Because mothers, we're always othered all the time. You know, we're never seen, we're never truly seen or experienced as the individuals that we are. It's a very common thread and a common theme, you know, in any group of mothers, where there's this frustration and annoyance with a lot of us, where we say, you know, we go to these professional meetings and we're called mum by professionals rather than our actual name. It's condescending. It removes our right to autonomy and our identity. And it's very important that in these processes we are seen as an individual in our own right, as well as the role that we have as mothers and carers. You know, that sense of being watched, observed, monitored, surveilled that we get as mothers is not imagined. It's not something that just happened for no reason. You don't get this feeling of being judged, you know, because of a figment of your imagination. It's because that is how systems are built. And that when you try to advocate for your child, particularly if you have a child that's neurodivergent or disabled, you are being surveilled, monitored, more so than a mother who doesn't have a disabled child. Very oftentimes, mothers of children with neurodivergence and disabilities are also disabled themselves, also neurodivergent themselves. And very often what happens is that those needs are completely eradicated, ignored, omitted, dismissed, because the whole entire focus of these systems is the mother being a good mother? Is the child being a good child? Are they fitting into a small box? If they don't fit into this small box, we're going to surveil, we're going to monitor, we're going to make notes, we're going to keep track of more and more and more, because there's a desire systemically to control, there's a desire systemically to make motherhood normative. And if you don't fit inside that very small binary of normative motherhood, you are subjected to more of this. You know, you're subjected to more scrutiny from social care, for example, and children's services. You're subjected to more scrutiny from schools, for example. And oftentimes what can happen with this surveillance, monitoring, record keeping, really systems of control that is designed to uphold normative motherhood and normative childhood in coexistence, causes a lot of trauma, which is now being recognised. You know, finally we're getting to the point where we're recognising, naming, and starting to understand that systems cause trauma to those of us who do not fit into that rigid binary. Those children who grew up neurodivergent, who then became neurodivergent mothers, are carrying the burden of not being enough, of not being good, of being the naughty child, the bad child. That then transcends into the bad mum or the bad mother, or I'm not enough, I'm not doing enough. And all of this is internalized and then something that is reinforced when we have to go through these assessments, you know, when we're thinking of, for example, how our body posture is, how our tone of voice is. We're actually self-policing all the time when it comes to trying to integrate with systems. We're continuously self-policing and self-judging, and therefore also, in some instances, if we're really honest, policing others and judging others, because there's this huge pressure and push to fit into normative mothering. But when you start to unpeel those layers and you start to really realize there's actually no such thing as being a good mother or a good child. There is no such thing. There's simply what has been normalized and what has failed to be accepted in society, you know. And once you start to realize and really come into your own and your own identity, that self-judgment starts to become less inflicting. It starts to become more apparent. It comes more to the surface, and then we can also help others too in that regard. It's very, very healing to find a community of mothers who are having a similar experience, who also have experienced that, and who speak the same language. And you don't have to be confined to this very small box of what normative is. And that also assists when navigating systems, when trying to speak with these professionals, because you're really coming from a solid foundation of identity, which is not this identity that's rooted in something unstable, untangible, and actually something that's not real. This binary is not real. It's a false dichotomy. So rather than cementing the identity in something so uncertain and, you know, subject to so much change because it's not real, it's rooted in the self as a separate entity and being a mother. You know, these two things can coexist in parallel to one another, and it's about time that systems start to recognize this and start to really put on board the research that has been done in this arena, because, you know, we no longer need to follow these archaic systems which are years and years behind when it comes to psychology and development and sociology. All of these things have been updated now. There's no reason to continue following this narrative, and what often results in mother blame, you know. So I just encourage you to self-reflect and really spend some time on unpacking all of this, especially if you've had to navigate systems, especially if you've been subjected to systemic induced trauma. Just be gentle with yourself, you know, and just take time to heal.